I have one question you didn't get to ask that I can answer quickly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Imagine today's society as a branch of civilization about to reach a dead end. Is this way we're living the only one that's available to us?
You've been really upfront about talking about the fact that, throughout your career, you've made a whole bunch of different types of films, working in different genres. And I found this really interesting when you're talking about this film. I hope for a project later in life when I might better understand what my personal style was. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, to explain that, I should talk about the great Japanese filmmaker Ozu. And the reason I should is because people don't quite realize it, but he was making films when he was very young, and throughout his entire lifetime, he was pretty much focused on making college comedies. And after a while, as he approached being elderly, he discovered what his real style was, and he made these masterpieces as an older man, like Toko's Story, and had this style of a totally not moving camera and stuff we associate with Ozu now. And I thought how interesting that he'd been a filmmaker from the time he was in his 20s, and yet wanted to discover what his style would be. And I wondered if I could possibly discover what my style was based on that great example.
When you say that, discovering what your style is, are you thinking visually? Are you thinking story?
The whole, I mean, cinema is, my early films were very different. Godfather, extremely classical. Apocalypse Now was, wild and camera always moving and quasi-surreal. One from the heart, very theatrical. So I became curious of like, what is really, who am I? And what I did was, after I made a movie called John Grisham's The Rainmaker, I decided to just take a hiatus of 10 years. It turned out to be more like 14 years. And during that time, that's why people don't understand what happened to me. Why did I essentially stop making films in the professional arena? And I was making little few $100,000 films without any of the great collaborators that I had worked with earlier, because I couldn't afford to bring them with me, and went to places like Romania and Argentina and worked. But I was really trying to understand who I was and what because I knew I had one foot in theater and one foot in cinema. And I knew, as you know, I believe that we're all geniuses. We are human family, but we all get gifts, but it's not always the gift you want. Mm-hmm. I've seen that a lot in my life. And I certainly didn't get the gifts I wanted. There are some filmmakers we could talk about who just have this uncanny ability to just see a whole movie and then create it. And I didn't get that. So what I got was the willingness to rework it a million times, and the energy and a relatively good memory, so that I could, and I got another gift, which is that my films are a little prescient. I made the conversation about an eavesdropper, and everyone said, what do you want to make a film about an eavesdropper? And 10 years later, there was Watergate. Or in this case, I've made a film about America as a kind of counterpart of Rome. And even still, people say, what do you want to do that for? Why do you want to? And now America, just like our Roman counterpart of the Republic of Rome, who had evolved senators who had become wealthy and powerful and wanted more to be more wealthy and more powerful than really do their job of running the country, which is exactly what's happened to us right now. So yes, I have those three talents, most important being that my films are a little bit like Cassandra. I mean, I see the future, but no one believes me.
It feels like in reading about, because you started thinking about this in the early 80s and reading about the writing process, but also you working with actors. It's not to say that you don't have a vision, but it feels like part of the discovery here was almost the constant rewriting, the constant process of wanting to be in the midst of this project evolving and adapting.
But I always did that because I in writing in particular, I realized that, if I could rewrite the script and make it 1% better, then I was willing to rewrite it 100 times, make it 100% better, which I did. In fact, most of my projects were just, in fact, my colleagues in the old days, even of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, used to refer to the script as a daily newspaper because it was always changing and I think getting better, but in very small increments. Also, there's another factor that you might find interesting, which is when you know how to make a film. So, in other words, by the end of the Godfather period, I sort of knew how to make a gangster picture. I mean, that. But when I approached Apocalypse Now, I had no idea how to make Apocalypse Now. And when you don't know how to make a film, the film starts telling you how to make it if you listen. And I can describe how it tells you, but basically you start.
How?
Well, like we were shooting Apocalypse Now, and the boys were on a boat, these 5 or 6 crew members, and they had smoke grenades because in Vietnam, the smoke grenade's purpose was that if you had a calamity and you needed a medevac helicopter to get a person, you would put a green smoke or whatever. And a yellow meant that there was some danger, and red meant don't land here. So that there was a purpose to the colors. But the boys were all sort of stoned on the boat. And they were just setting off smoke grenades in the wind. And we looked at it, and it looked very surreal. And we all said, my collaborators, me and Dean and Vittorio Storaro, let's do more of that. and then the normal stuff, we said, let's do less of that. And so by just doing, let's do more of this kind of image of the boat and this strange surreal thing, it started to make Apocalypse Now more and more surreal, to the point that when we got to the end, the ending, which was a typical war film ending, a big battle, no longer was going to be appropriate. The movie had become surreal. And Brando, who's a very brilliant person, not just as an actor, he came on board. First thing he said to me is, oh, you painted yourself into a corner, haven't you? So that's exactly what happened in another category with Megalopolis, is that I was doing unusual things with the actors to sort of, one thing I had learned in this hiatus was, since in movies they pay the actors the same to shoot the film as they do to rehearse it, they don't want you to rehearse it very much, or their idea of rehearsal is to take the script and go to the location with a photographer and work out the shots so that when you are shooting, you're going to go faster. It's nothing to do with how to make the acting more beautiful or more unique. So I like to work with actors without worrying even about the script, more, how to give them through improvisation and theater games a better understanding of who they are, or even to program memories. And very often you have a story about a husband and wife, and it's about their later life. I would have had them do improvisations of how they first met, or how she first told him that she was in love with someone, whatever it is. Real people have memories, but actors don't. I got to play. I know the script isn't about that part of their marriage. So I like to provide all sorts of opportunities for the actors. What I'm going to say, I'm going to contradict, for the actors to work to become the characters. In fact, what really happens is the characters inhabit the actor, but it's a little more subtle to understand what that means. But you know what I'm saying. In other words, that acting is clearly, along with writing, one of the key elements of cinema and theater. But there are a lot of things about cinema. Orson Welles famously said you can learn on a weekend, but you can't learn about acting in a weekend, and you can't learn about writing in a weekend. So that's something you do over and over and over again. You get better at it.
One of my favorite sequences in the movie is the MSG sequence, Madison Square Garden sequence, which, like Apocalypse Now, kind of goes into this surreal world. And my understanding is that, and maybe we could talk about that in context of some of these theater games, because my understanding is some of how that scene evolved came from that. I heard about the rope sequence with Adam.
All the acting. evolved that way. In other words, I started doing takes since I had rehearsed a little bit, and I did something really weird. Today, to get when you have a big cast, this is more than 4 people, getting them all together at one time is like that game where you have to get the marbles and you get 3 in, and it is impossible if you have 11 main cast members. So I had every cast member have an understudy who was, in movies it's called a stand-in. Even back when I was young, I never had stand-ins. I would have stand-ins, but they were also understudies. They knew the lines, and technically they could play the part. In theater that happens, in film that doesn't. So even for Megalopolis, I had understudies for everyone. So when I had my crummy 5 days of rehearsal, which I always ask for 3 weeks, and I'm lucky if I get 3 days. I didn't have all the actors, so I included the understudies so I could do entire sequences, and it was interesting. But what happened is that a lot of developmental work did happen, and so when I was actually shooting the movie, say I was going to shoot 7 takes. I mean, that's roughly how many takes I tend to. The first 2 or 3, I might have them include like the rope thing or pick up my hat or something that was a theater game, not intending to use it, but intending to have it make the final takes, which would be more normal, better. And then as we all looked at it, the collaborators, the editors, myself, and the photographer, we all said, gee, let's do more of that, which was the weird stuff, and less of that, which was the way you're supposed to do it.
And a lot of that stuff ended up in this movie, right?
That is what more started, just like with Apocalypse Now, to make this film, whatever style this is, which I've never quite seen anything that I can say it's like, usually you can say everything is like Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, but in this case, Beauty and the Beast is, of course, a big influence of all modern films, but not this. So I was making a movie that like something I'd never seen before, and I didn't know how to make it, which means we all said, well, let's do more of that, and let's do less of that, and little by little, the movie started to become something in this weird group improvisation.
So even something like Adam going into Macbeth or Hamlet.
Don't ever say that word. You'll have bad luck.
What?
That's the Scottish play.
Oh, right. Okay.
Call it the Scottish play.
The Scottish play.
We're in a theater.
Got it. But even something like that was more of an exercise?
I told him at one point, just as preparation, I mean, he didn't know what, actors never knew what I was going to ask them to do, which is part of the fun of it. The fun of working with actors is that in the space where you are, which is, say, here, you can't get in trouble. Right. You can't be bad. Right. In other words, we're going to play together, and we're going to have fun together. And the only thing is, there's only one rule of what you're going to do is that you're not you're this actor. You're this character. So in other words, you can't say, oh, my character loves Chinese food. My character loves little short women. My character, you can't say that. You can say, I love Chinese food. And you think that's easy, and it is for about 20 minutes, but to do that for 10 hours, it's a little exhausting because you start forgetting, oh, wait a second, oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to be. So I started doing things like, I also discovered a lot of stuff that when you're doing that and you're playing and you can't get in trouble. In other words, no one's going to say, oh, you're terrible. It's like they have in schools where there's no abuse allowed. It's you're fine in here. Just you have to be in character. That's all you have to be, and that was the environment we made the movie in. So of course I would say things like, well, let's just for the hell of it, let's do this, knowing that we didn't have to take that take, and that later we would have the last take 5, 6, or 6 and 7 was the regular movie take that looked like every other movie, and we never wanted to do that. We all said, let's make it be like the earlier takes. Let's do more of that. And so, as I said, the movie started to just make itself.
Reading a lot of the things that your collaborators have said, the actors, editors, composer, they all feel like they had just incredible freedom to experiment. And it seems like a wonderful process for everybody. You've been very open about not being able to quite find that balance with the art department, both in terms of an ability to set course, but also this need to adjust. I'm wondering if you could talk about that and how much of that had to do with your vision versus the way that we make films today.
I was very attracted to the production designer through a project that she did in New York called, that Ed Norton directed, Motherless Brooklyn. I thought that they had achieved a sort of, in movies, everyone's fanatic about knowing when the period is because that implies what the hair looks like, what year the cars are. Are they on iPhones or are they in regular? In other words, period is very important to the entire crew, be it the prop department, the costume department, because it dictates. And I thought in Motherless Brooklyn, they had achieved an ambivalence about the period, which was good. I mean, it was part of the theme of.
Because you're thinking back, you're thinking forward, you're thinking.
In other words, they had found a way to do it, so I was very attracted to it. But the production designer she was excellent working on these independent films, and I was very impressed. But also, she had made it in the Marvel world, and her next picture was going to be a giant film at Trilith in Georgia, where they had these huge subsidies. And she suggested very earnestly that let's, on the tail end of the movie she was doing, which was Guardian of the Galaxies, we could just sort of turn into Megalopolis and have advantage of some of these very talented craftsmen that were already there and get the benefit of the subsidies in Georgia, which are very generous, as you know. And she even had a suggestion of a production person that she had herself elevated to producer that would be good for me to hire. So where this became a problem was earlier than in the earlier periods where you sit around with everyone and just talk about, where I realized that her thinking was different from Motherless Brooklyn, and it was more like what she was now working on, which was Guardian, a big Marvel picture. And big Marvel pictures are art-centric. They have a production designer, a supervising art director, and maybe 5 art directors. In other words, a lot happens dominated by the art department. And I'm not like that. My films, I don't like the kind of regular digital effects. I like more the way I did it on Dracula with my son, where it's more handmade. And I pushed back. I don't want just giant art department. I want also the costumes to be, as I did in Dracula, where I fired the production designer because he was not understanding that the costumes were a big part of the set. It's always, at the beginning part of the movie, everyone sort of grabs their share of the budget very optimistically, thinking they're going to be doing most of the movie. But of course, as we know, movies are not made by one department. It's but if everyone, if you end up with the art department grabbing 60% of the resources and the costumes 50% of the resources and special effects 50%, you end up with 300%, which doesn't exist. Right. So you end up wasting a lot of money. And that sort of gives you the setting of what I was in for. Also, the art department was so big that it was all sort of situated in offices in Trilith, and therefore there were, when we went anywhere, there were trucks which took the stuff to smaller trucks which went to it was gigantic. And I thought the only solution was to limit the size of all these departments more according to how I knew the movie was going to be made. And that's when I started to do very detailed production designs. So I would sort of not want to do what I thought was too much like a Marvel vision and do what I thought was what I really had in my head, which is what the picture looks like.
And so you started on November 7th, and then there's the Christmas hiatus and you shut down, and I guess the thing was well on the way to a huge budget.
Well, that's when I thought when we come back, we're starting to go way over budget, because not only for the enormous charges of the art department, but also the costumes, as you see. To do all that costume work and all that individual hair work, many things were expensive. It wasn't just the art department. So I had to shrink everything. And when I suggested that we would fire one of the 5 also I once went to an art department person and said, oh, I'd like to do a sequence where people look like statues, so there has to be miniature cars. And she said, listen, I can't step on any toes. You have to go talk. And I had never experienced that in a movie. I mean, I would go to electricians and say, when he kisses her, shake the thing. But it was, finally I said, I was told if you fire one of the art department, we're all going to resign. And they did. And I did, and they did. And then a week later, there was a big story of chaos on the set.
Yeah. But, it's interesting, that ability to change course, and you also made adjustments with visual effects. You made the allusion to the fact that you kind of went back to...
I wanted the movie to look handmade, which it does.
I want to talk about that because you made reference to Dracula, and you wanted to work with Roman, your son, in a similar way. I wonder if we could talk about what your vision was for visual effects, but also I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your collaboration with Roman, who by all accounts is a brilliant filmmaker, but also someone that is really good behind the scenes of figuring out a lot of these logistics, right?
Well, to talk just briefly about Dracula, the issue was that, as you know, I always honor the original writer, so it was Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I knew that Dracula had been written by Stoker right around the same period when movies were being invented. So I said, as I often do, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to make Dracula as if I was a guy in 1905, or, as if I were Méliès, and only do effects the way they did in that period, which was like Méliès had been a magician. So my son actually knew quite a bit about that. And so we began to think of what it would be like to shoot with mirrors and tricks and shadows and stuff. And that was just the beginning when digital effects started to become a big deal. And the whole visual effects team said, oh no, that we can do this and we can do that. And when I realized that they weren't gonna do what I wanted, I fired them, basically. I mean, in movies, you sort of have to do that, because if you have an element that has a different vision than you do, they're going to have the different vision that you do the whole movie. Also, we had a very important production designer on Dracula. And when everyone did their resources, turned out I was $20 million over budget. And I said to him, the production designer, my vision is that the sets are going to just be big empty space for Dracula. So they're just empty sound stages. The sets are going to be the costumes. Well, you don't tell that to a production designer, and he got very upset, and I fired him on Dracula. So now I was making a movie with no production designer, or whoever the young guys who were the assistants, and they did great, and no special effects, and the special effects guy was this son of the great Stanley Donen, who's someone I just admired so much. But that was the same sort of situation as ultimately happened, that they didn't want to do it the way I wanted to do it. And I would say all the time that I'm the only one who knows what the director wants. So why are you telling me what the director wants when plus I was financing it too. So I found myself that even though I was trying to make this thing the way I hoped to or imagined to, I had basically, what really happened, as always what happens, is the art department was jealous of how much money the costume department was spending, and the special effects were sort of adamant that the best way to do the effects were to do them digitally, and not the way Roman did it, or the way I wanted to do it, which was interesting, but certainly wasn't as perfect. So when you're in that situation, you have no choice, if you're the director, is to eliminate this type of discord, which I did.
In 2001, you were full-on pre-production with this. You got the offices in Park Slope, you're doing table reads, and my understanding is you shot like 30 hours of second unit material.
Well, I hired the wonderful, spectacular photographer, Ron Fricke, and my idea was that since no one knew I was doing this, I was in Park Slope in Brooklyn, that we, a lot of the second unit involved going up on high, which means 3 guys instead of 2 trucks and 12 guys, which normally happens once you're an official movie. So I thought in a way I could do the second unit very under the, still, I mean, everyone got paid, but there weren't a lot of them. And therefore you can see in some of the shots that are in the film that these extraordinary places where for a guy to get up
stuff
on,
stayed in the film.
how to get up there, was hard.
So we can see some of Ron's stuff in that.
Oh yeah, all the establishing stuff. His work is beautiful. Also, I took a chance in those days because it was all shot digitally at a time when digital movies weren't being made.
Anybody who sees the film will understand why, after 9/11 with the Russian satellite, why you would abandon this temporarily. And
well, I didn't. People lost their family. I didn't want.
But no. I mean, and then in 2007, you also shelved it, saying you needed someone to support it. You needed support developing it. And you talked a lot about repicking it up, and there was a lot of factors in that. Turning 80, the pandemic, and time. But I'm curious off something you said though. How much of it also was that you needed to finance this yourself and you were in that position? Was that something that was to actually make this happen? Was
just
that what
go
it was?
back to Apocalypse Now. I was working for Paramount Pictures. I had made the first Godfather, which everyone thought was going to be a disaster. Turned out to be this massive success. Then without wanting to, I made a second Godfather film, which was equally very successful. I mean, between the two of them, it had won 4 or 5 Oscars. And yet when I said, now I want to do Apocalypse Now, Paramount said, well, we don't want to do it. And I couldn't have been hotter director at that time, or more awarded, or more, both creatively, good reaction critically, and big money. So if I couldn't make Apocalypse Now, then here I am, an old 85-year-old guy who hadn't made a movie for 14 years when I was, fiddling around with experimental stuff. How was I going to do it now? So when I did do Apocalypse Now, I own Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
And you know why I own it.
Yes, no one would pay for it.
Nobody wanted it. I mean, it's not even paid for it. They didn't want it. So there I was on this immense production. Interest was up to, I'm borrowing the money, and interest was up to 20%, which is unheard of. I mean, today, you know what interest is. And it looked like, and then it got reviews like, this is the biggest disaster Hollywood has ever produced, and all this negative stuff. It was a nice lift to win the Cannes Festival, but it still had very opposite. In other words, there were a lot of, when it came out, it didn't, I don't know, maybe it got a nomination for one of the photography or art direction or something, but it didn't get any wrinkle of success, and it opened sort of lukewarm. But what happened with Apocalypse Now is people never stopped going to see it. To this day, it's still a big earner, and it still goes see. So, I didn't expect that. The only one actually who predicted it was my brother, who said, you watch and see, this is not the disaster you think it is. And it wasn't. Apocalypse Now earning is essentially what enabled me to go in the wine business and blah, blah, blah. So I have experience with a movie like this, differing opinions, people saying it's great, people saying it's the worst movie ever made. That guy, Frank Rich, said it was the biggest flop, failure any Hollywood had ever done. It really hurt my feelings because he was a very important critic. But so here I am at 85, back in the same boat, sort of, except when I did it this time, I wasn't the hot young director. And so if I wanted to make it, I was going to have to finance it myself.
We need to finish up. Considering that response, because for my generation, it's a stone cold masterpiece. That's the world I came into. But in reading about how that film was treated in 1979 in Cannes, does that change for you with financing Megalopolis and the response that came out of Cannes this year? Does that help you define or change what your definition of success is for this film?
No,
Did
my
that help
definition of success has never changed. It is to this day. It's not stars. I was always very offended when the New York Times went to that method of having ratings for movies because, I mean, art is not sports. You know, they're trying to make sports out of it where there are winners and losers. And, you know, art is, you know, how many stars does the Parthenon have as compared to the Taj Mahal or the pyramid? You know, art is not like Notre Dame. Is that 4 stars or 5 stars? Why are we doing this? And I was very upset when I saw that started to happen. The only real test of success, it's happened to me a few times. Did you see All Quiet on the Western Front?
Sure.
That this young guy wanted to see me, and I saw he was a very talented, accomplished filmmaker, and he came to see me and said, I became a filmmaker because I saw Apocalypse Now. That is the greatest award when someone young who is going to make beautiful films, and there's an abundance of young talent today, more than ever. If someone, like with Rumblefish, there are people who say, you know, that was a big flop, by the way, Rumblefish. But people have come to me who would make beautiful films and said, I became a filmmaker because Alfonso Cuarón told me he became a filmmaker because he saw The Rain People.
James Gray, Soderbergh, sir, there's a lot of people that you influenced. There's a long line of people.
That's
like
better
Berger.
than Oscar. And Oscars are nice and all that, although it didn't get me to make Apocalypse Now. I had plenty of them. But what I just said is the highest honor. And what is it really? It's the test of time.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations on this one.
Oh, thank you so much. You're very kind.